My name is Hart. I turned 33 2 weeks ago, but I hadn't really thought about celebrating until the invitation came. My mother had decided to throw a grand retirement dinner for my stepfather at a place called Marrow and Oak, the kind of restaurant that didn't list prices on the menu and whose walls smelled faintly of old money and truffle oil. It was the kind of place that served dishes with names longer than your first heartbreak, and where servers looked you in the eye only if you had the right watch on your wrist. I hadn't been back to Charleston in over 4 years. Before I take you into what really happened that night, and what came after, let me just say this. If you've ever been the quiet one in a loud family, if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who claim to love you, or if you're still carrying the weight of being underestimated, then I hope this story finds you like a mirror in a moment you didn't expect. And if it does, hit that subscribe button. Not because this story is dramatic, but because it's real. And because sometimes hearing a story like this reminds us we're not the only ones finding our voice after years of silence. I don't know if I was more surprised that they invited me or that I considered going. My relationship with my family had always been tense at best. To be fair, I was the one who'd put distance between us, but it hadn't exactly taken much force. They pushed, and I walked. That's how it had always been. My siblings, Avery and Graham, were the golden ones. Avery with her curated Instagram perfect life, married to a surgeon and posting inspirational captions about discipline and kale. Graham with his startup that didn't make a profit for 5 years, but somehow raised millions because he networked well. And then there was me. I was the one they always whispered about when they thought I couldn't hear. The one who could have had so much potential, but threw it away. They thought I was working as a part-time assistant at an independent art gallery in Portland, Oregon. Which wasn't entirely untrue. I did technically have an arrangement with a gallery there. What they didn't know, what I'd never told anyone in the family, was that I had built and now ran a company that quietly powered over 200 art spaces and cultural nonprofits across the country. It had started as a software tool to help small arts organizations manage their donor lists and grant applications. Now, Hart Systems managed back-end infrastructure for some of the most respected cultural institutions on the West Coast. We had just landed a partnership with the Smithsonian's Digital Outreach Program. Our valuation last quarter, just shy of $70 million, but I never posted about it, never sent updates. I had learned early on that nothing I did would be as good as Graham's vision or Avery's 6-figure yoga retreats. And maybe some dark part of me wanted to see how far they'd go in dismissing me before I gave them reason to stop. The day I left for Charleston, I packed one bag. I chose clothes that wouldn't reveal anything. No designer logos, no silk scarves, no sleek Loro Piana anything. Just a dark blue wrap dress, modest heels, and a necklace with a brass compass pendant my grandmother gave me before she passed. I didn't want to show off. I wanted to observe. When I arrived at Marrow and Oak, the staff at the entrance greeted me by name. I saw the quick glance of confusion from the valet when I gave him my rental car keys. Nothing flashy, just a gray Prius. And walked through the glass double doors like I owned the place. Because technically, I kind of did. One of my earliest investments had been in the group that purchased and restructured half the historic district's food scene. Marrow and Oak had been part of that acquisition. It was one of the few touches of irony in the story I was about to walk into. Inside, it was all polished wood, dim golden lights, and conversations that smelled like generational wealth. I spotted my mother before she saw me. Her posture was perfect as always, arms poised mid-gesture, her laugh effortlessly delicate. She wore a seafoam green dress with diamonds that sparkled even under the warm haze of vintage Edison bulbs. My stepfather Henry was next to her, looking bored but elegant. And there, flanking them like 2 well-trained sentinels, were Avery and Graham. Avery saw me first. Her expression flickered for half a second. Recognition, judgment, something else I couldn't quite place, before she pasted on a smile and waved me over with a manicured hand. "Camille, you made it," she said, the way one might acknowledge a dog finally learning a trick. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, hugging her briefly. She smelled like eucalyptus and effort. Graham grinned. "Wow, Portland must be treating you well. You look Not as lost as usual. He laughed like it was a joke, but I caught the sideways glance he gave my shoes. My mother leaned in for a kiss on the cheek. Darling, I was worried you'd be wearing that thrifted cardigan again, but this is actually very presentable. Good to see you too, Mom. Henry didn't say much. He never did with me. I think he was still waiting for the day I turned into someone worth investing energy in. Someone that didn't make him have to explain awkwardly at fundraisers what I did for a living. They had booked the private room in the back. Of course they had. I was led through a corridor lined with wine bottles older than my niece, and ushered into a room set for 20, the table crowned with bone china and candles that flickered like they knew something the rest of us didn't. Dinner was a performance. Avery held court like always, dropping references to designer baby formula and her most recent TEDx talk on the monetization of mindfulness. Graham was worse. He'd apparently just gotten back from a crypto conference in Iceland and wanted everyone to know about the insane synergy he'd witnessed between fintech and social reform. I sipped my wine slowly and let them talk. It didn't take long before the poke started. "So Camille," Avery said after the appetizers, "are you still involved with the arts? That gallery, what's it called again? Indigo something? It's called Mosaic and Dune. I still collaborate with them." Graham smirked. "Is that what we're calling it now? Collaboration? Because last I checked, they were doing a fundraiser to keep the lights on." "I think they're doing fine, but I'm not here to talk shop," I said, smiling. "But we are," Avery trilled. Henry's retirement marks such a huge transition for the family. Graham's launching a podcast with some VC friends. I'm speaking at SXSW next spring. Mom might even write that lifestyle book she's always dreamed of. My mother blushed modestly. "Oh, stop it, Avery. But yes, the publisher has been in touch." I laughed softly. "Guess I'm the underachiever as usual." Graham raised an eyebrow. "If the shoe fits, sis." Something in me itched, not with the urge to retaliate, but to reveal, to throw off the cloak and just tell them the truth. But I didn't. Not yet. I had spent too long learning how to live without their approval to suddenly beg for it. Instead, I leaned back, letting their words brush past me like wind on stone. What none of them knew was that I had received an offer just the week before to sell Hart Systems for $110 million. I hadn't decided yet. Part of me loved the quiet rebellion of building something invisible to them. But another part, perhaps the one that still wore that compass necklace, wanted to be seen. Not for money or milestones, but for meaning. And that part of me was growing louder by the hour. By the time the main course arrived, venison loin with blackberry reduction and a side of something too fancy to pronounce, the tone of the evening had shifted ever so slightly. The wine was flowing freely, loosening tongues and sharpening judgments. It was Avery who first crossed the line from subtle condescension into outright dismissal. She leaned over her plate, resting her cheek against the back of her hand, as if preparing to deliver a lecture from a place of concern. "Camille, have you ever thought about, doing something a bit more stable? I mean, I know art is your passion or whatever, but you're not exactly getting younger." There it was, that thinly veiled jab. The idea that everything I did was a hobby at best, a temporary detour at worst. I set my fork down quietly. "Stable like becoming a brand ambassador for collagen supplements?" Her eyes narrowed, and Graham let out a laugh before covering it with a cough. "I'm just saying," she said coolly. "You're smart. You always were. It's a shame not to put that to use." "I put it to use every day." "Doing what exactly?" Graham interjected. "Framing posters for art students." I tilted my head. "Managing a team of 32, overseeing multi-million-dollar contracts, building platforms that support art therapy programs for veterans, for one." It came out before I meant to say it. I hadn't planned to peel back the curtain, not yet. But something inside me cracked open with the force of their certainty. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then my mother let out a short, awkward laugh. "Oh honey, 32 what? Customers?" I didn't answer. Let them guess. Their disbelief hung in the air like smoke. Avery sipped her wine with exaggerated calm. Graham pulled out his phone under the table, probably trying to find evidence I was bluffing. I glanced down the table at Henry, who had barely looked at me all evening. He was in deep conversation with a colleague from his real estate firm, utterly unaware, or uncaring, of the tension humming around me. I took a breath and looked across the room. That's when I saw him. Marco, the general manager of Marrow and Oak. He noticed me, did a double take, and immediately made his way over with the kind of warmth that couldn't be faked. "Miss Hart," he said, smiling broadly, "you didn't tell us you'd be joining this evening. We would have reserved the Somerton room for you." The conversation at the table paused like someone had pressed mute. I felt every pair of eyes land on me. I smiled politely. "It's a family event. I didn't want to make a fuss." "Nonsense. You're one of our most important patrons. I'll have the sommelier bring over that vintage you liked last time. The Camus, wasn't it?" "That would be perfect. Thank you, Marco." As he walked off, I could feel my mother recalibrating. Avery blinked slowly. Graham's lips parted, but no sound came out. I picked up my fork again and sliced through the venison. "Camille," my mother said carefully, "how do you know the manager here?" "I hosted a fundraiser here last quarter," I replied. "One of several, actually. Marrow and Oak partners with Hart Systems for our annual Cultural Equity Initiative." "Hart Systems?" Graham asked, his brows furrowed. "My company." His laugh was forced. "You named it after yourself? That's bold." "No, I named it after our grandmother. The compass pendant? It was hers. She said the heart in her name came from generations of resilience. I wanted to build something with that spirit." Silence again. Then Avery whispered, "Wait, are you saying you run Hart Systems? The Hart Systems? As in?" She glanced down at her phone, her eyes scanning furiously. I nodded. "Oh my God," she murmured, her voice caught somewhere between awe and panic. You're the Camille Hart who's on the Forbes Social Innovation list?" Graham was still trying to keep up. "Wait, you're funded by the Bonneville Group? That's why I've been seeing your name at pitch nights." He turned to Avery like he needed backup, like surely she could explain what was happening. "You told us you worked in a gallery," my mother said, stunned. "I do. I volunteer. Every Wednesday afternoon." They stared at me like I had just confessed to being a spy. And in a way, I had been. I had lived undercover in my own family. They hadn't seen me because they never thought I was worth looking at. I reached into my bag and pulled out the gift I had brought for Henry. It was a leather-bound first edition of Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, the book he always claimed made him fall in love with the idea of the American road. Inside, I had slipped a note, along with a signed letter confirming a $50,000 endowment I'd established in his name at the Charleston School of Architecture where he had once lectured. I handed it to him as dessert was being served. He opened the book slowly. When he found the letter, his eyes widened. "You did this?" he asked, for the first time really looking at me. I nodded. I didn't realize." "I know." He looked at me as if he didn't recognize the woman sitting across from him. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Avery answered for me, with the reflexive cruelty she thought passed for wit. Maybe because she enjoyed the whole mysterious black sheep thing. I looked her dead in the eyes. Or maybe because I wanted to see if any of you would value me without needing a financial disclosure statement. The table went still. Graham swallowed hard. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "What's not fair is the way this family has equated love with status, concern with control, and presence with performance. I spent 10 years building something that matters. And not once did any of you ask me what made me happy. You just assumed I failed. And you were comfortable with that." My mother's face had gone pale. "We were trying to protect you." "No," I said, my voice low but steady. "You were trying to protect yourselves from having to accept that not everyone wants the life you carved out for them." There were no cameras, no audience, no applause. Just me, finally saying what I'd carried like a secret disease for years. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt clean. Like air after a storm. Marco returned quietly with the bottle of Camus and 2 fresh glasses. "Shall I decant this for you, Miss Hart?" I nodded. "Please do. And Marco, bring enough for everyone." Avery reached for her glass like she'd been parched for days. Graham avoided my eyes. My mother stared at the tablecloth, folding a corner between her fingers. I didn't need to win, I just needed to be seen. And finally, for the first time in my adult life, I was. The wine had been poured, but no one was drinking. The silence that followed my admission wasn't heavy with anger. It was weighted with something far more disarming, realization. Not of my success, but of their blindness. For the first time, they were catching up to a version of me they had never taken the time to see. Henry cleared his throat, still holding the leather-bound book I'd given him, like it was a ticking artifact. "I owe you a thank you," he said, his voice quiet, brittle. "Not just for this endowment, for showing up, for being someone we didn't know we should have been proud of. It was more than I ever expected from him, and somehow not enough." But I nodded. "Thank you, Henry." As the table slowly fell back into a semblance of normalcy, dessert arriving, servers refilling water glasses, I excused myself and stepped outside to the terrace. I needed air. Not because I was upset, but because something inside me had shifted so suddenly. It felt like I was standing on unfamiliar ground. The Charleston night was soft, humid, with the weight of early summer. I stood by the balcony railing, overlooking the city's lights. Somewhere down the street, I could hear a saxophone playing. It was the kind of melody that made you feel nostalgic for things you never lived. I thought I was alone until the door behind me opened. "Avery." She walked slowly, arms crossed, heels clicking softly against the stone tile. "I didn't know," she said, her tone half defensive, half hollow. "You could have told me." I didn't turn to face her. I tried. "Do you remember when I called you 2 years ago, when I wanted to tell you about the pilot program we launched in 3 cities? You said you were late for a meeting and told me to email it." "I did. You never replied." She was quiet for a moment. "I probably didn't think it was that important." "You didn't think I was that important." She sighed, leaning on the railing beside me. "I was jealous, you know," she said. "Even before tonight. Not of the company stuff, of your calm, the way you never chased things. I've been sprinting for years and I don't even know where the finish line is anymore." I finally looked at her. "Then why keep running?" "Because I'm afraid I'll fall apart if I stop." It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in 15 years. "You don't have to keep performing, Avery, not with me." "I know," she said softly, "but it's who I am, or maybe, who I let myself become." We stood in silence again. She picked at the edge of her bracelet. "I'm sorry for how I've treated you," she said, eyes still on her hands. "Not just tonight. For years. I thought I had you figured out. Turns out I didn't even try." "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you think." When she left the terrace, there was a little more weight in her steps, but a little less armor in her spine. A few minutes later, Graham found me in the lounge near the bar. He slid into the leather seat across from mine and stared at me for a moment like he was trying to recognize something he'd never noticed before. "I Googled your company," he said without apology. "You've got partnerships with the National Arts Coalition and the Echelon Foundation. How the hell did you do that without seed funding?" I smiled. "Bootstrap. I built the prototype myself. Got a grant from an education nonprofit in year 2. The rest was grit." "You built it yourself?" he repeated, almost offended. "You weren't even a coder." "No, but I learned." He leaned back. "I raised $6 million before I had a product, and you..." He laughed in disbelief. "You actually did it." I took a sip of my drink. "Why does that surprise you so much?" "Because I never saw you as competent, serious, capable. No, not those. I knew you were smart, just invisible. I never saw you because I wasn't looking." He shook his head. "That's on me." "It's on all of you. But yeah, it's also on you." Graham let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know what's weird?" he said. "When I thought you were broke and floundering, I pitied you. Now that I know you're successful, I envy you. But neither of those things have anything to do with who you actually are. That's the part I can't shake." I nodded slowly. "It's easier to label people than to learn them." "I thought you were passive, but you were just quiet." "Not the same thing," I said. He looked me in the eye for once, not scanning for some angle. "You did good, Camille. Like, really good." I smiled, surprised by how much I still wanted his respect. "Thanks, Graham." He paused before standing. "If you ever want to advise or collaborate on something real, I'd be open." I didn't commit to anything, but I didn't shut the door either. By the time I returned to the table, only my mother remained. She sat with her back straight, a napkin folded into a square in her lap, a spoon resting beside her untouched creme brulee. "I thought you'd left," she said without looking at me. "I was on the terrace." She gave a tiny nod. Her hands, normally so precise, were fidgeting with the edges of the napkin. "I feel like I don't know you at all," she said finally. You don't, I replied. Her eyes lifted to mine, glassy with tears. And that's my fault. I waited. When you were born, you were so different from the other two. You didn't cry when left alone. You played by yourself. You were internal. I didn't understand that. Still don't. I sat down beside her, not across. I didn't need you to understand me, I said gently. I needed you to accept me. Her chin trembled. I didn't. I judged. I thought I was helping. I was pushing you towards something I thought was safer, more admirable. But it wasn't mine. She reached out and held my hand, awkwardly, unfamiliar. You built something incredible, and you did it without asking for our validation. I admire that now. But I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to. I squeezed her hand back. It's not too late to get to know me, Mom, if you want to try. She nodded, then stood. I want to. I watched her walk toward the valet with a grace that was no longer armor, but something quieter. Maybe humility. The night was winding down. Most of the guests had left. The restaurant lights dimmed a little, as if it too were ready to rest. But inside me, something had just begun to stir, a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about being known. And finally, I had stopped hiding. 3 days after the dinner, my inbox was still flooded, with follow-up notes from guests, curiosity from colleagues who'd heard whispers, and one particularly blunt message from Graham. What exactly does your office look like? And is it as cool as Forbes makes it sound? That was his way of asking for an invitation without admitting he wanted one. To my surprise, they all wanted to come. On the following Thursday morning, my mother, Avery, Graham, and Henry flew out to Portland on a family visit, something we hadn't done since I was in college. I had sent a car to meet them at the airport, just a modest SUV with a polite driver named Roz, but my mother still commented on how low-profile everything felt. She meant it as a compliment, I think. The next day, I met them in front of the Hart Systems building, a restored brick and glass structure in the old district, not far from the river. It had once been a soap factory in the early 1900s, and we kept the original facade as a symbol. Clean beginnings, built with grit. The inside was something else entirely. The moment they stepped into the glass atrium, everything changed. Natural light poured down from the skylights above, catching the colorful murals painted by local artists which lined the inner walls. A cafe buzzed in the corner, serving locally roasted espresso and vegan pastries. An open staircase spiraled upward through 5 floors of collaborative spaces, meeting pods and digital project zones. The energy was kinetic. No one wore suits. No one barked orders. People were in small huddles, laughing, sketching, prototyping, focused. It was exactly what I'd dreamed of building. A place where creation wasn't a privilege, but a responsibility. Graham's eyes went wide. This is not what I expected. Good, I said. We began the tour on the 2nd floor where the UX design team was running a sprint workshop with public school teachers from Atlanta and Milwaukee. I introduced my family quietly, not making a spectacle. They watched as a soft-spoken coder walked through an accessibility prototype that translated lesson content into multisensory formats for neurodiverse students. They're developing this for a district where 42% of kids are undiagnosed dyslexic, I explained. This tool will change that. Avery blinked. This is you do? Part of it. We moved up another floor, where the data visualization team showed them impact dashboards, literacy rates rising across schools that had adopted our platform, graduation rates climbing, absenteeism shrinking. My mother stood silently in front of a digital wall chart that mapped Hart Systems' outreach across 36 states. We track results in real time, I said, not to impress donors, but to stay accountable. Henry stepped forward. This is real, he muttered. Yes, Henry. It's always been real. You just didn't know it because I didn't wear a badge for it. They followed me into my office, just a large, bright room with a worn leather couch, 2 bookshelves, and a whiteboard cluttered with notes and team doodles. On one wall hung a framed newspaper clipping from the first time we were profiled in a local journal. I left it there to remind myself how small things start. My mother sat slowly on the couch. She looked around like she was seeing her daughter for the first time. You built all this? She asked, with a lot of people, and a lot of late nights. She glanced toward a photo on my shelf, Me with my original 3 co-founders in a basement apartment. One of them had a baby on her hip. Another was wearing a jacket patched with duct tape. "How did we miss this?" my mother asked quietly. I didn't answer. I let the silence do the talking. That afternoon, we had lunch with my executive team. Diverse, brilliant, wildly different from the people my family usually interacted with. The conversation was lively, passionate, often technical. And to their credit, my family listened, really listened. Later, I walked them through the Foundation's project wing, classrooms in Haiti, mobile libraries in Appalachia, tech hubs in Nairobi. The kind of impact I never could have imagined when I was sleeping on couches in year 1. Eating rice and boiled eggs because our burn rate was a living threat. As we stood in front of a display showing our next expansion initiative, art therapy programs in trauma-affected high schools, Avery spoke softly. "You actually did something that matters." I looked at her. "You could too, if you wanted." She turned away, but not with dismissal, with discomfort, the kind that signals something inside her had started to shift. Graham lingered behind with me after the others moved on. "I don't think I've ever seen an office where people actually looked happy," he said, "because they're doing something bigger than themselves." He nodded slowly. "You think I could do something like this?" "That depends. Are you ready to unlearn half of what you think makes you valuable?" He gave a sad smile. "That's the hardest part, isn't it?" "Always." That night, we had dinner at a quiet neighborhood place I liked. Family-style tables, candles, no frills. My friends came too, people who'd been with me since the beginning. No titles, no expectations, just good food and warm presence. My mother was seated between 2 of our education partners from Arizona. I caught her laughing at one point, not politely but genuinely. Avery helped pass dishes. Graham poured wine. And Henry, the man who once treated me like an accessory to someone else's story, raised his glass halfway through the meal. "To Camille," he said, eyes meeting mine with something resembling humility. "You showed us how narrow our definition of success was. I'm grateful for the correction." I didn't toast back. I didn't need to. The moment was already full. After dinner, as we stepped into the night air, my mother pulled me aside. "You said I could still get to know you," she said. "I'd like to start with coffee, just the 2 of us. Not to talk about business, to talk about you." I smiled, slow and surprised. "I'd like that too." Graham and Avery joined us at the curb, waiting for their car. We stood there, the 4 of us, not as characters in a broken family performance, but as people trying, really trying, to see each other. "I'm thinking of taking on some education law cases," Avery said casually, almost offhand, as if admitting something taboo. "Pro bono, just 1 or 2. "That sounds like a good start," I said. Graham cleared his throat. "There's this non-profit accelerator in DC looking for mentors. I might reach out." I didn't respond. I didn't need to say anything. Their words weren't confessions. They were beginnings. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and no music. Just the city breathing around me. I thought about that dinner in Charleston, the way I had walked into it expecting nothing, and left with everything that mattered. They hadn't changed overnight. I hadn't forgiven everything. But something inside all of us had broken open. And where there were cracks, there was finally light.
6 months after that night at Marrow and Oak, everything looked the same, but everything felt different. Portland rolled into fall like it always did, with slow-burning leaves and crisp air that smelled faintly of rain and coffee grounds. My company continued to grow, steadily but intentionally. We expanded our partnership with Indigenous art councils in the Pacific Northwest and launched an accessibility pilot with 3 urban school districts. But inside me, something had softened, not in weakness, in grounding. I had stopped living like a secret. Once a month, my mother called, not out of guilt, but out of curiosity. She asked questions, real ones, not about earnings or board seats, but about books I was reading, projects I cared about, what I cooked on Sundays. Sometimes her voice trembled with hesitation, like she was still afraid of saying the wrong thing. But I didn't need perfect. I needed effort. And she was giving it. Avery and I started something that neither of us labeled, but both of us leaned into, a fragile but growing connection. We'd meet for weekend hikes or tea when she passed through town on business. She sent me an article last month titled Redefining Power, The Rise of Quiet Leaders. No caption, just the link. I understood. Graham surprised me the most. 2 months after visiting my office, he sent a photo, him at a community pitch night, mentoring a group of high school students working on an eco-startup. No caption either. But the smile on his face didn't look staged. A week later, he texted, "You were right about validation. It's a hungry ghost." I had to reread it twice before I believed it came from him. And Henry? He didn't become warm overnight, but he invited me to co-sponsor a scholarship in my grandmother's name, Hart Women in Design. When the program launched, he stood beside me on the stage. Not as a father figure, not as a formal ally, just as a man trying to rebuild something real. That was enough. As for me, I didn't change everything. I still woke up early to journal. I still ended my days with a podcast and a cheap lavender candle, but I also started allowing more people into my orbit. Friends, collaborators, family. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because I was no longer afraid of being seen fully. One Sunday afternoon, I found myself walking through my old neighborhood in Charleston. I had flown in quietly for a site visit at one of our Southeast partners and decided, on a whim, to drive past the street I grew up on. The houses looked smaller than I remembered, the oak trees taller. I parked and walked past the sidewalk where I used to ride my bike with training wheels and scraped knees. The house was still painted the same dusty blue. The windows still framed with white shutters my mother insisted on keeping pristine. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. Closure wasn't in confrontation. It was in peace. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd in the yard across the street. A little girl, maybe 9 or 10, sat on the porch with a spiral-bound notebook and a pencil. She was sketching something. Her eyes narrowed in focus, her hands steady, unbothered by the cars or voices around her. I smiled. That was me once. That was still me. The difference now was I didn't need to hide in the margins anymore. Back in Portland, we launched a new initiative called The Quiet Ground. It was a digital storytelling lab for youth in overlooked communities to create multimedia pieces about identity, belonging, and redefinition. Not to go viral, just to be heard. To have a place where visibility wasn't a privilege, but a right. At the first showcase, I stood in the back of the room as a 15-year-old boy from a rural reservation showed a short film he had made about grief and the color orange. When the lights came up, people stood to clap. He looked stunned, then smiled. I didn't need applause, but in that moment, I felt it deep in my chest. The full circle of a story long misunderstood. Success had never been the goal. Visibility had never been the finish line. But freedom, to define myself, to choose love without condition, to walk through the world without shrinking, that was the reward. And now I carried it like my grandmother's compass. If you've ever felt unseen by your family, by the world, or even by yourself, then this story was for you. And if you're still on your way to becoming the version of you they said would never exist, then you're exactly who this space is meant for. So before you go, take a second. Hit that subscribe button. Not because this was dramatic, but because it was honest. Leave a comment if a line, a moment, or a memory came flooding back. Share it with someone who needs a quiet reminder that their worth was never up for debate. Because around here, we believe that the ones they overlook are often the ones who rise the highest. And not to prove anything, but to live fully. You're not alone, and your story is just getting started.